I'm David Frankel. I'd like to talk to you today about some old pottery, fragments of pottery. We'll start with this particular sherd, here held in the hand of my friend Ron van der Wal. This fragment, this sherd, like the two we see illustrated below in photograph and in drawing, are from two different types of vessels. The upper one is a more open vessel, a large bowl. It has a little bit of decoration on it, a low ridge of applied clay with a rough incision around it. The vessel below, with a more constricted neck, is a different type for a different purpose. This one has no decoration. They're not particularly well-made vessels. They're functional, but they're not fancy. The clay is quite coarse, fine grits, often little bits of shell included in the fabric, the wall of the vessel. Although not fine pottery, they nevertheless serve their purpose. They're functional and useful. They're made using a paddle and anvil technique, and here in this photograph we see two people at work, a mother and daughter perhaps, or maybe aunt and niece. And having started to shape the vessel and hollow it out, they're beating the wall using a paddle and anvil technique, holding an anvil, some stone or something of the like inside, and beating on the outside to thin the wall and give it its shape. They're making very symmetrical vessels, appropriate wall thickness, and then later they'll be fired in a bonfire firing. These vessels that we've just looked at come from near the town of Kerema in the Gulf province of Papua New Guinea. Some villages in the area still own old vessels of this sort. Here, a group of people displaying proudly a large bowl that they have. We're in this area to look at the archaeology, and particularly interested in the pottery. It's an area of quite steep hills covered in thick rainforest, with rivers in the low-lying areas between. Archaeological sites, the sites where people used to live and work, are hard to find in these areas, and only where there are clearings in the thick rainforest is it possible to identify the ancient settlements. Particularly, we'd see it here as in a clearing for a large garden. The trees have been cut down and burnt off, and then a variety of plants will be grown here for a few years. It's an area sometimes difficult of access. Modern transport isn't always the best way, and often it's better to move up the river systems using canoes and then walk up the hills from the rivers below. Villages sometimes only lasted for a few generations, and sometimes they were even more temporary accommodation while people were working their gardens. Villages often set up along the ridgetops. People lived there and then discarded all their rubbish down the hill slopes. That would have included the bits of pottery, broken fragments. That was our primary interest in looking at this archaeology. And here we're excavating a small amount of one such deposit of material discarded from the houses. You can see this is really a shell midden, a dump of shells, people eating shellfish collected mainly from the rivers, but included within that are all sorts of other domestic refuse, including the pottery as we see illustrated above. And here we're working on another site, here beside the main road. We're excavating a few squares within a considerable area of which there's shell-midden deposits from the ancient village. We've excavated at a number of these small sites, and then looking at the pottery, different aspects of its shape, we can place these in a sequence. The earlier ones have particular types of structure. Later, you have a different sort, and we can arrange them in a sequence and see how people moved, not so much in a migration, but a movement of one village to another, to a third, and so on, across the landscape. This pattern of movement matches that recorded and remembered in oral traditions. Here in the lower left, the late Nigel Oram is recording oral traditions about this and other aspects of behaviour along the Papuan coast. And the older people in the village can explain their stories about what happened in the past. The young, as you can see, listening eagerly. Moving from Kerema, we can travel a considerable distance further west, further into the Gulf, and a very different environment. Here we're in the delta of the Purari and Kikori rivers. They flow down to the sea. It's flat. It's tidal. This isn't solid land, but mudflats covered in mangroves and in nipa palm, innumerable waterways, channels intersecting the little mud islands. We'll come to Kinomere village and the largest of these mud islands. It's a good thing we arrive at high tide, because at low tide you'd have to wade through thick, heavy mud because the water has receded. But we'll come in our large canoes or smaller canoes and to reach the village. The centre of this village is a series of low, slight rises and depressions with the houses around the edge of it. It feels like quite solid, dry land. But it is, in fact, not natural land, but artificially created and built up. Within the fences, people deposit all sorts of vegetable matter, things that they've discarded from houses or making other things, food refuse as well. And this is built up over many generations to create a firm, solid, dry land. It wouldn't take long, however, if people were to abandon this village, for it to turn back into swamp, and the mangroves would take over. Canoes are an essential part of life in this area. It's impossible to get into it or move around it or do anything without canoes. We've seen one larger canoe when we arrived at the village, but there are innumerable small ones used by one or two people or small families as they go out to collect food or to move between one village and another. They're made, or traditionally were made, using stone adzes. Nowadays, of course, people would use steel tools, but hollowing out a dugout canoe of this sort takes considerable effort with a stone adze. Now we have to remember that this is all mud flats and tidal delta swamps. There's no stone close by. So stone, and indeed the larger, more solid, substantial logs from which to make canoes, had to be brought in from somewhere else. It would not be possible to live in these areas without contacts and relationships with people further inland or in other areas where stone can be found. And the story of the settlement and how people live in these areas is then one of interactions rather than isolation, because you need goods to be able to live there and you need to have good relationships with others. In this village too, we were able to excavate and to find the pottery, which was our primary and initial focus of interest. Here we're excavating a square in the centre of the Kinomere village, in that more open area in the centre. It's not very deep. The picture on the top left, you can already see the water. It's the water table below, and above that there are deposits of shell and organic material, a few posts rammed into the earth of the piles on which earlier buildings had been set. We're finding some pottery, but we're also finding large amounts of bone and shell. Shell because shellfish, other seafood, a major item of diet in this area. Another important source of food comes from fish, and here a group of villagers are out catching fish. It's low tide and they're wading along the channel with fishing baskets and catching large quantities of fish to bring home for food. But the primary aspect of food in this area is sago. Here some men are chopping down a large sago palm. They split open the outer bark, exposing the pith inside, and then using pounders or choppers, they're crushing up the inside of the sago palm, chipping it into small pieces, and these are then later processed. Usually now it's the women who take over, placing the small chips of sago, the pith, in a trough, and then washing it with water and crushing and squeezing it to squeeze out the starch, the food that's coming from the sago. Processing large quantities of this into the stick mass of solid sago, solid starch, rich carbohydrate food, a major staple in this area and in other parts of the tropical lowlands. Well, we found lots of pottery here, and with the pottery from the other sites we'd already excavated at the areas around Kerema, we can start to compare them and to look for patterns and changes through time. The pottery, as we know, is handmade techniques, and we must turn our attention to who was making the pottery and how was it distributed. We can see when we analyze the pottery several different things. This somewhat complicated diagram is showing two different but related aspects. We've arranged the sites in chronological order, the earliest to the left, the latest to the right. The bars show the percentage of vessels, of bowls indeed, that are fairly simple shapes, very much plainer shapes without any particular angles within them. The blue line is the diversity of bowl types, whether they are varied within the site or whether they're much more uniform. We can see both of these are changing through time. Basically, the vessels are becoming increasingly simple and uniform through time. And we have to think why this is so. We can also analyze the clays of the pottery, because one of the things we're interested in is the sources of the pottery and identifying the trace elements within the clays. We would hope to be able to trace where the pottery is made. Here we were using a technique of particle-induced X-ray emission using the ANSTO facility, the government nuclear agency at Lucas Heights in Sydney. We've been looking at our pottery from Kerema and Kinomere village in the Gulf province. But in fact, the pottery doesn't come from there. It wasn't made there. We knew this, and that was one of the reasons we were exploring the area, to find samples to identify more specifically where it came from. But we knew it probably came from the areas around Port Moresby, a long way to the southeast. This is the area where pottery was being made. We have a good deal of information about the recent manufacture and distribution of pottery from that area. So we have to think about how did pottery move from those villages, those pottery manufacturing villages, to the Gulf of Papua. Well, during the last 500 years or so, Motu women, and Motu were the people living in that area, produced about 35,000 pots per year for trade at the height of the trading system. It started smaller and became larger and more complex in scale over time. And so one of the aspects, of course, of our studies was to attempt to look at the history of change. We can see in the photographs taken a little over 100 years ago, people in the villages collecting pottery ready for distribution. very large quantities of pottery. And this formed the basis of what we know of as the Hiri trading system, a major undertaking where men would organize themselves to build large canoes and then sail from their villages in the Port Moresby area up along the coast to the Gulf province, taking with them a variety of trade goods. It was a complex undertaking, and like all aspects of work in Papua New Guinea, surrounded by danger both physical and supernatural. And so it was surrounded by many different aspects where people needed to know both the magic as well as the techniques in order to build and sail their canoes. These are large catamaran canoes, perhaps double-hulled canoes with their characteristic crab claw sails. We have photographs then from 100, 120 years ago showing men loading up some of those thousands of pots onto their trading vessel. They also took other items, particularly shell valuables, armbands, and sometimes these neck ornaments, chest ornaments, were highly valued in many areas of Papua New Guinea. And these are an important part of trade and exchange. Ownership and exchange of these goods added to their prestige and status of people within their communities. The outward voyages, taking pottery, some shell valuables, took place when the winds were appropriate in the period sometime between June and September of the year. And people would sail 200, 250 kilometers or more along the coast, landing at villages and settling there for a while in order to exchange the pottery and the shell valuables for other goods. And then sailing home again some months later, between January and March. And what were they bringing back? Well, largely they were bringing back sago. And there's some discussion as to whether the voyages were initiated in order to bring large quantities of food back to fulfill shortages in the home villages. But it's equally likely that the primary motivation was to enhance the status and prestige of the men who went on them, particularly the men who organized and structured the fleets that sailed on these voyages. The canoes they came back in were no longer maybe double-hulled catamarans, but they needed large, much larger vessels, because sago, of course, is far heavier than pottery. So 10, 12, or even up to 16 canoe hulls were bound together to make a much larger canoe to come home. Within a short period of returning home, the sago was distributed and eaten, the large canoes broken up, and the canoe hulls then distributed. They were both the means of sailing home and an important aspect in their own right in terms of the trade system. This was a major undertaking involving many men away for very long periods. They were developing connections, they needed personal relationships, and they needed other associations in order for this to develop. So over generations, there are changes in the pattern that this took place, and our pottery gives some indication of this. Increasing quantities of pottery, but also increasing uniformity of the pottery. It's more simple, it's more structured, and perhaps it's an indication of larger scale mass production. Or it's also because some villages around Port Moresby began to dominate the area and to produce more and more pottery. So there's less diversity, with fewer villages contributing to these large-scale voyages. We can see then a whole series of interactions, relationships, exchanges associated with status, connection, numbers of people, and the scale of trade. Women in these villages producing the sago and the pottery. We can see the need for the movement of other items, such as axes, into areas where there was no stone. The movement of other goods, such as the shell valuables. It's a complex, integrated system of relationships along the coast and the coast into inland into other areas. It demonstrates how sophisticated, complex, evolving and changing things were over the last several hundred years in areas such as this, or indeed in other parts of the world. If you have any interest in following this up, there's a large literature on the Hiri, both earlier recording and documentation by European visitors, travellers, traders, and others, and then the more recent analysis of this through oral histories and archaeology. Well, I hope you found this little excursion into New Guinean prehistory of interest. Thank you.